Today, we are gathered to discuss optimizing your roster for weeks 15 through 17, aka the fantasy football playoffs, aka the greatest time to be alive. Be sure to stay tuned to the end of this show. We will cover your listener questions and submit our one move to make ahead of week 12. I think at this point, playoff bound teams, and I think people for the most part know if their team is going to be playoff bound or is close to being playoff bound. Either way, you should be optimizing here as we get into week 12, week 13 for your roster. So today's show is dedicated to that. I have a few thoughts on general strategy for this time of year, Daigle. The first one is handcuffing is more valuable the later we get in the season, right? I can't risk my fantasy playoff success being tied to Joe Mixon or Kyron Williams and not having Dameon Pierce or Blake Corum on my roster, assuming that they're out there. The second strategy take I would have is if my bench is deep enough, I want to stash the best defenses. Not only for me, and some of this depends on how many points your defenses score in your league. In some leagues, it's crazy how many points defenses can account for. But if you stash the best defenses, even if just one or maybe two that come around in the fantasy playoffs, that's good for me, but it's also blocking my opponents from streaming in those defenses. I know so many people out there are streaming. And lastly, Daigle, if I've been streaming quarterback all year, which I think is a really viable strategy, Baker 1 week, Geno 1 week, Stafford 1 week, A-Rich 1 week, whatever you want to do for matchups, I think it's worth getting ahead of it now so that you have the pick of the litter to have the best streamers in weeks 15, 16, and 17 at the quarterback position, obviously a very important position. So those are three things that I'd be thinking about right now with a playoff bound team. Daigle, any more thoughts on general strat for the playoffs?
I would max 2 defensive stash, and that includes the one in your roster, just because remember, defenses are replicable. We can get those points still on the waiver wire, whereas if a starter is injured for running back, that's something that we can't just plug into the flex with every single player on the waiver wire come week 15 on. So I do still want to be stingy about the defenses I have, understanding that since the league moved to 17 games, we have seen more starters per year make starts at the end of the season, and thus defenses, in my opinion, become more easier to find. Also, to your point, just to add even more into it, and if you are streaming quarterbacks and then stashing quarterbacks just to get ahead and plot out those weeks, that goes into just understanding your roster as a whole. Like, we're going to say a lot of things on this show. We're going to talk about every position, but understand the context that you need for your roster. You might not even need, honestly, a backup quarterback. Maybe you're so top heavy at running back that it doesn't even matter if you fill your bench with one injury away guys. You might actually need the Ricky Pearsalls of the world to come through if an injury were ahead of them. So definitely just understand your roster more than anything else.
Okay. Yeah. I want to start, Mark, with the running back stashes here. And hopefully you guys have been using the one injury away list that Daigle has been keeping up with all year. I don't on my bench for good teams, I have so many of these guys. This is like my whole bench is just these kind of guys, because all I'm trying to do is be like, well, if someone gets hurt, I have a star. If Breece Hall gets hurt and I have Braylon Allen, I have a star that is going to make a big difference for me in the playoffs. Same with Trey Benson, Blake Corum, Jordan Mason, Charbonnet, Akers, Ray Davis, Algier. We have all these guys here in the top tier. Mark, any more thoughts on running back stashes and how you handling bench and running backs here at the playoff time?
As Daigle alluded to, I think it's super important to prioritize the higher upside bench stashes over things like a defense or a kicker. If there's a tiebreaker, definitely go to these high upside running backs. I think Daigle lays it out super nicely here in the tier one. These are guys that we're confident if the running back in front of them were to go down, they would get the lion's share of the touches and probably project for 12, 14, 15 points in a week, which is just massive leverage come fantasy playoff time. So definitely want to prioritize the high upside running backs on my bench for the playoffs. I think, as you mentioned too, Adam, that handcuffing your running backs now is more of a viable strategy rather than trying to pick off other teams and create a full super team. Because if you are in line for the playoffs, then obviously your roster is solid elsewhere, and you can just kind of lock in one legitimately good running back spot if your starter were to go down. So I like those ideas. In terms of deeper leagues, if you're looking for some running back stashes, I have some names that I think are somewhat interesting. I think Cam Akers is a somewhat interesting stash. We've seen him emerge as the RB2 in Minnesota. Aaron Jones has dealt with multiple injuries throughout the season, and the Vikings have a good playoff schedule. They get the Bears, at Seahawks, and versus Packers in the playoffs. We're going to talk about a lot about the Bucks running backs. Bucky Irving and Rashad White, I think, are both good. And Sean Tucker has gotten kind of phased out, but I think he's an interesting upside stash as well. We saw him have a big game earlier this year against the Saints when Rashad White was out. So those are a couple guys that I think are good in deeper leagues. But yeah, this one injury away article from Daigle is a very solid resource, and one that I will be using a lot down the stretch.
Yeah, I said this on Cam Akers. Right now, he's miles ahead of Ty Chandler. If something were to happen to Aaron Jones, I still think that would be a timeshare, right? Whereas if something happened to, say, James Conner, I think it would be a ton of Trey Benson. Or something happened to Breece Hall, a ton of Braylon Allen. We already know that if something happens to Kenneth Walker, Zach Charbonnet is going to get 20 touches. Like, it's going to happen. Obviously, with Algier as well, we saw McClellan get in a little bit last week, but I really think that, especially if they're winning games, Algier, if something happened to Bijan, would be a total smash. There's certainly thinner ones as we move down here. Mark mentioned Sean Tucker. That's an interesting one. Bucks have such a soft schedule. If something were to happen to either one of them, Rashad White or Bucky Irving, so you kind of get two outs there, I think is an interesting one on Sean Tucker. And then Jalen Wright is another one. I know Daigle and I talked about him some on the waiver wire show, but they seem to be losing favor in Raheem Mostert. And it's similar to Sean Tucker, where you get a chance for two injuries, right? Like if something happened to Achane or Raheem Mostert, you're ending up with a really good play there in Jalen Wright. So I would not be afraid to stash these guys. Oh, and one that we should mention that happened today. I saw DeAndre Swift miss practice today. They were already leaning into Roschon Johnson more. Me and Silva talked about that, as well as me and Daigle did yesterday on the waivers show, about the changing role for Roschon Johnson with Fraudrin gone. So there's some more down here that I think are still worth stashing, even in the tier 2 on Daigle's list. Jack, any more thoughts on running back here before we move on?
Yeah, I think you guys mostly hit on all the names that I think are worthwhile. I do want to just really agree with Mark that we want to be shooting for the really high upside guys here. They're guys who, if something happens to the guy ahead of them, they can push your team from a playoff team to being really the front runner for your league's championship.
Yeah. Daigle, Dameon Pierce here at 16. My gut was he would be higher. Any more thoughts on the Mixon situation? Because I guarantee you that there are a ton of playoff teams that have Mixon. Like, Mixon's advance rate is so wild. If you were a Mixon owner, how much a priority would Pierce be for you?
In my mind, and willing to get y'all's thoughts, Dario Gumbawale would still have the pass catching role, since that's not really Mixon's style. It's also, as for someone like Cam Akers, who's up there because he's iced Ty Chandler, and I do think Chandler would be sprinkled in, but Cam Akers has shown with his increasing route participation, even a season high mark this past game, that he will still play the pass catching role. Pierce, I don't think would, but again, open to thoughts.
Yeah, I think like Mixon was never really a 3-down back when he was in Cincy, and like I think that Pierce would go right into the Mixon role. I agree with you. We'd see a little bit of a Gunawable, but yeah, I'd probably make Pierce more of a priority if I had Mixon here. Like, I would almost certainly want to have Pierce.
I will say, looking at their playoff schedule, so they do have a Week 14 bye, which is a bummer. One of the teams with a late bye. They get Miami in Week 15, and then at Kansas City in Week 16, and Baltimore in Week 17. I mean, Kansas City and Baltimore are two of the worst matchups for running backs. So that's somewhere that I would probably still prioritize someone like a Trey Benson or Tyler Algier or Braylon Allen rather than handcuffing Mixon, because if Mixon goes down, like I still don't think I would really want to start Dameon Pierce against the Chiefs or the Ravens. So kind of like the soft skills of comparing the matchup as well as opportunity.
Yeah, we actually got a question about this from Z Glicks. He said, how much do you factor in playoff schedule when you have someone like Mixon who's putting up career numbers so far? Does it move him down a tier, or do you feel he is matchup proof? It's an interesting question. Obviously, we're going to have Mixon projected for fewer points against good defenses than we will against bad defenses, right? That's not rocket science. I still, like, what are you going to do? You know, you're going to trade away Joe Mixon like 2 weeks before the playoffs because he has a tough schedule. I don't know. Any more thoughts on this here, Daigle, about Mixon's playoff schedule?
Well, We saw it already. He played a Lions defense that no one runs against. He rushed for 46 yards on 25 carries. So he still got 25 carries in that game. And then also still 4 targets and 44 receiving yards with a touchdown. So even if the touchdown were not to come, we're talking about 25 plus touches. And we take that floor every single week.
Yeah. Okay. Anything more at running back here and move on? I think the Khalil Herbert thing is interesting. We'll talk more about the Bengals. They've just been loath to use him, but my God, if they're going to give Chase Brown 30 touches every week, he's got to be like in danger of getting banged up here at some point. Any other running back thoughts?
This goes deep. So even if you're in like 14 team leagues, it goes all the way down, for instance, to Jeremy McNichols, Justice Hill, Keaton Mitchell, guys like that. So I would just continue using the list throughout the postseason.
Okay. Running backs are not the only stashes or handcuffs to consider. I think there's some interesting wide receiver ones as well here, Mark. Let's start with San Francisco. We've seen Juwan Jennings break out. We've seen Debo sustain health here for at least a little bit. And we've seen Ricky Pearsall get into the mix as number 3 wide receiver. Now, we are getting George Kittle back this week, which will have to create depressed target shares for some of these guys. But Mark, what do you think about prioritizing a Pearsall type as a stash right now?
I think Pearsall's a great one because you have multiple outs to more playing time. They also have a great fantasy playoff schedule. They get the Rams, Dolphins, and Lions. The Rams and Lions matchups in particular are really strong. And given the 49ers loss against the Seahawks this week, we know they're going to be battling for the playoffs down the stretch as well. So, and giving it their all. So I think Pearsall is probably the top wide receiver stash or handcuff I would want to have on my bench. Maybe after that Buccaneers game, he's a little bit more owned in leagues than we would like. But yeah, he's certainly the top one. I think looking at maybe some other spots, Dontavian Wicks for the Packers. I know we've kind of beaten this drum to death on Wicks, but he has a lot of paths to getting more playing time. And the Packers also have a great playoff schedule as well. They get the Seahawks, Saints, and Vikings. It's our 6th best wide receiver schedule based on DVP. So those are kind of the 2 standouts that I think are worth stashing and holding on to if you're worried about your wide receiver spots or want to handcuff them.
Yeah, I also thought Jalen McMillan, who Daigle has here on the list right behind Wicks, is interesting in that, I mean, do they, there's got guys out there like Sterling Shepard and Ryan Miller. I mean, is Jalen McMillan going to lose to those guys? He's been hurt. I think it's not crazy to think that down the stretch with Godwin obviously out for the season, it should be McMillan and Evans, but
yeah,
I think
that's definitely fair. And he, he was active for that Chiefs game, but ended up not playing due to the hamstring. They went through their bye. Hopefully he got some practices in and will be back. So I think that one is a good name as well.
Yeah,
it's definitely a question mark coming out of the bye. It's just going to be an ambiguous situation behind Evans, but that could be good for McMillan, especially since they want to play him, I assume, in the slot.
Okay. Tight ends, Jack. I don't think that I would handcuff a tight end. Like, it would have to be a really dire situation. The one spot where I thought the handcuff was worth it was if you drafted Mark Andrews, you could consider carrying Isaiah Likely on your team, right? That was what I was thinking back in August. Turned out that it's the opposite. If you have Isaiah Likely, you should be carrying Mark Andrews as the handcuff. But it's obviously going to be a tough start between either one of those guys unless one goes down. So it's not even like a handcuff situation. But I do think if one of those guys were to go down, Andrews or Likely, the opposite one would be probably a top 5 or top 6 option, depending on matchup here down the stretch. So that's the one thought I had at tight end. Any more tight end thoughts here, Jack?
Yeah, I think the Ravens are really the 2 that are worthwhile to pick up. There are some other pass-catching tight ends like Britton Strange in Jacksonville or Elijah Higgins in Arizona who would have the pass-catching role if Trey McBride or Evan Ingram go down, but I really think it's hard to feel good about starting either of them in a fantasy playoff matchup, and there's probably someone better on the waiver wire. But Andrews and Likely, yeah, I mean, if one of them goes down, the other one is going to be awesome, especially if we've seen what Mark Andrews' role has been like without Isaiah Likely, and it was by far his best usage of the season. The problem is I assume Likely is less owned and probably more attainable in a lot of leagues, and he would still be serviceable if something happens to Mark Andrews. And then going back to receivers just for a second, I think Noah Brown and Adonai Mitchell are also decent handcuffs. We've seen Noah Brown out target Terry McLaurin in 3 straight games. His numbers have not been all that good, as Jaden Daniels has kind of struggled while dealing with both tougher opponents and the rib injury. But he's had a long week. The ribs should theoretically get healthier as time goes on. And then Adonai Mitchell, really like Dontavian Wicks, has 3 paths to increase playing time, and he's gotten 0.31 targets per route run on the season. So he's earned targets. Obviously, with Anthony Richardson under center, it's not perfect, but I do think that with 3 paths to playing time, it's at least interesting.
Yeah, if Flacco was still under center, I would make it a priority to have AD Mitchell on a deep bench as a stash. But with A-Rich, I'm probably not prioritizing it quite as much, but I definitely agree that they need to get a look. I mean, once they fly the playoffs, they should be getting a look at AD Mitchell regardless, ahead of Alec Pierce. All right. Let's go to streamers. So I'm sure a lot of you out there are streaming quarterbacks on a weekly basis. If I was doing that, I would probably try to plot out who I wanted to have here for weeks 15, week 16, week 17. Make sure that I get them or have a chance to get them. Start with week 15 here, Mark. Bo Nix home against the Colts in week 15. I know people automatically assume that the weather in Denver is bad in December. I mean, I don't think that that's like the likeliest scenario whatsoever. Yes, it could snow, but it's just as likely or probably more likely to be like 50 degrees and sunny and perfect. So, I'm not worried about the weather on Bo Nix. If he's out there, that home game against the Colts, I think is super interesting. The other one for week 15 that I thought was Justin Herbert home game against the Bucs. I'm not sure Justin Herbert is necessarily available in most leagues now, though. So what do you think about week 15 quarterback streamers for the streaming bros out there?
Definitely like Bo Nix and Justin Herbert, as you mentioned. I do think they're owned in quite a handful or in vast majority of leagues. Baker Mayfield, just the Bucs have an outstanding schedule the rest of the way. If Baker's still out there, I don't think he really is. He's 90% rostered on ESPN. So I do like him, though. They get the Chargers in week 15, Cowboys week 16, Panthers week 17. One that I think is out there in probably every league that you could get is Will Levis. They get the Bengals at home in week 15. He's played at least a little bit better. He does have Calvin Ridley there. So I think Levis is one that's, probably free in every league and could be a potential streamer in week 15. But I think you nailed it off the top that if Bo Nix and Justin Herbert are out there, those are the top 2 names that I'm looking at.
And somebody might drop them, and I mean, then you could pick them up as well. God, it's like,
yeah, Nix has the week 14 bye. So maybe, I doubt anyone would drop him in week 14, but there's that chance.
It would be hard pressed for me to grind my cock all year long, get to week 15, and then play Will Levis like that. I'm down to do some aggressive things. I don't know that I could actually pull the trigger on that. I might rather have a far worse matchup with a better quarterback, but
yeah. One other name that might be more appealing is Kirk Cousins as well. They play at the Raiders in week 15. Hopefully Darnell Mooney is back for then. It looks like he tweaked his hamstring, but they're going into their bye this week, and that could be an explosion spot in a dome against the Raiders.
For sure. All right. Week 16, Daigle, I think is a little bit thinner from what I saw. The best one that I saw for week 16 was Baker Mayfield at the Cowboys. Obviously no Chris Godwin hurts, but Mike Evans is going to be back this week. They have been dropping Baker Mayfield back at such an outrageous rate. So I'd actually feel pretty good about Baker in that week 16 game against the Cowboys. Any other week 16 streamer quarterback spots you want to mention?
I look at stashes for Superflex leagues in particular because I play in so many. And as crazy as it sounds, I still have Trey Lance stashed everywhere, even for week 15. That's a 2-week stretch, 15 and 16 against the Panthers and the Bucs, assuming he's under center. It was 350 yards in garbage time on Monday night for Cooper Rush, but the Cowboys are clearly going nowhere and continue to get destroyed by 3+ scores weekly. At some point, they have to see what Trey Lance can do, if only to stay in the headlines since they're an irrelevant organization. So I definitely think we see Lance in the next coming weeks. And if so, the schedule for a rushing quarterback opens up quite well.
Also in week 16, Russell Wilson gets that Ravens secondary. You also get Anthony Richardson against the Titans. Anthony Richardson is definitely out there in a bunch of leagues. I actually just added him in one. As Mark said, you get Kirk Cousins against the Giants as well. So there's certainly some options here for quarterback streamers. Yeah.
Will
Okay.
Levis is a good shout out though, because since he's come back from injury, he has been somewhat better. A lot like it was only a 1-game sample against a very bad Jets defense, but Anthony Richardson also looked better, especially when throwing downfield. Levis is 23 of 36 for 8.9 yards per attempt from a clean pocket since he came back. So maybe he could provide some spark down the stretch since he's still in evaluation mode for next year.
Okay. Week 17, Jack, Fantasy Championship week, there are a lot of options. I mentioned Bo Nix. He plays at the Bengals in week 17. Baker Mayfield, home game against the Panthers in week 17. Justin Herbert gets the Patriots in week 17. Certainly a lot of options here. Jack, any more thoughts on quarterback streamers for Fantasy Championship week?
Yeah, I think those guys are a clear priority if they're available. I assume that at least a couple of those guys might be owned already in a lot of leagues. And if you're looking at guys who are widely available, it gets a little bit rougher. I mean, Will Levis has another really easy matchup against the Jags, who are our easiest defense against opposing quarterbacks. But like you said, it's hard to pick up Will Levis in your fantasy championship and feel good about starting him. But maybe in Superflex, if you're in Superflex, Bryce Young also gets the Bucks, who have the second easiest defense for opposing quarterbacks. But in single quarterback, I really think the guys you mentioned should take priority, and guys like Levis and Bryce Young are only for Superflex.
Yeah, I mean, you might want to get ahead of it with a better quarterback here for week 17 if those guys are owned, because you're otherwise going to end up with like Levis or DeVito is home against the Colts and stuff like that is going to be tough to pull the trigger on. All right. Defense stashes. You know, defensive distribution, like Daigle said, is hard to project, and it's usually not that wide in projection. In other words, like most of our defense will be projected somewhere between 5 and 10 points. So you're not giving up that much by just coming up and showing up week 16 and picking up a defense off the wire. So if your bench is not that deep and you can't stash one, I think that's totally fine. If you do have room, though, to both block your opponent and get some really good ones, there's certainly options here. Week 15, Falcons, home against play the Raiders. And then week 16, they play the Giants. I mean, Minshew and DeVito back-to-back for the Falcons. That stuck out to me as a really good one. The Bucks, I know we keep talking about this. Bucks get the Cowboys in week 16, Panthers in week 17, and then Cardinals for that week 16 game at the Panthers, I think is an interesting stash as well. Mark, any more defense thoughts here for the playoffs?
Yeah, there's actually a few that I like. The Falcons do have a good schedule, but they have like one of the lowest pressure rates in the league, a really bad D line. So I'd actually probably pass on them. If I were stashing defenses, I would look at the Cardinals. They're my top choice. They get the Patriots at home in week 15 and then at the Panthers in week 16, as you mentioned. The Bucks do have a good week 16 and 17 schedule, but they play the Chargers in week 15. So if you're stashing the Bucks, I like pairing them with the Ravens, who get the Giants in week 15, or you can pair them with the Cowboys, who gets, I believe, the Panthers in week 15. So if you're getting the Bucks, I do think you kind of need like a week 15 contingency plan. I do like the Ravens the most there if you're pairing. I also just think the Bills are pretty sneaky. The Bills are going into their bye this week, so maybe teams are dropping them. They have a great week 16 and 17 schedule. They get the Patriots at home and the Jets at home in week 16 and 17. So I like the Bills. Their defensive line has come a long way this season. So those are the top teams I would toss out.
Okay, yeah, I like that as a lot. Daigle, any defense thoughts before we move on?
Mark covered it all. I do really like the looking for the Bills on your waiver wire in week 13 shout out. That's very sharp. Beyond that, though, honestly, if it just becomes desperate because you are stashing backs, this is how I play. I then typically look in the waiver wire around this time for defenses opposing rushing quarterbacks, because at least then we can tack on some floor points for sacks.
Okay. All right. We have some questions here I want to get to. Hopefully that was a good or at least helpful for you guys getting ready for the playoffs. Want to get to some of these questions that you guys submitted via Twitter, though. Jack, let's start with this one. Are there any teams or fantasy stars you're worried will mail it in and miss fantasy playoff weeks with made-up/exaggerated injuries because their teams have nothing to play for? So I am worried about the Bengals, and I think that this is one that's really important because Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Chase Brown, Joe Burrow are going to be part of so many playoff teams. The Bengals are like 10% or something like that now to make the playoffs. If they lose another game, it's going to go to like 0% for them to make the playoffs. You also have T. Higgins in the final year of his contract. He's going to be a free agent. Jamar Chase never got a deal done. He's going to be looking for a contract. If I was those guys and the Bengals had treated me cheaply throughout my career, make me walk across a street and up a hill to get to practice, you better believe that if I have a nick in week 16 or week 17 or week 18, I would consider sitting, and like, I hate playing fantasy like that, but I do think that it should be on people's radar for the Bengals guys that could possibly get nicked. I don't know how you can make moves around that. I guess you could trade them away. I wouldn't feel that great about that. Another thing you could do is pick up Yoshi Voss, pick up Jermaine Burton, and try to figure it out that way. But that's the biggest one that I'm concerned about. Jack, any more thoughts on teams that might be mailing it in late and benching some stars?
Yeah, I think the Bengals are a good one. I think the Browns are worth mentioning because if they go to Dorian Thompson-Robinson, it's just going to be really ugly for their passing game. DTR has been maybe even worse than Deshaun Watson from what we've seen of him in actual NFL games so far. He's also much more likely to run than Jameis Winston, so pass volume drops a pretty good amount. So right now we've got Cedric Tillman, Jerry Jeudy, David Njoku, guys who are legitimately fantasy relevant under Jameis Winston, and all of that could evaporate pretty quickly if they turn to DTR. I think someone like CeeDee Lamb, who is dealing with a back injury, and the Cowboys are currently going with Cooper Rush, could eventually turn to Trey Lance, as we mentioned. There's really no reason for him to continue going out there when their season is effectively lost. And then, I don't know, I mean, the Jets have to have just a a wide range of outcomes. It feels like a situation that could be on the verge of blowing up. But that's not so much based in an injury like CeeDee Lamb or a QB change. It just feels like with everything bubbling around their team, something that could go south in a hurry.
Yeah, one more that comes to mind is the Rams, who I think will stay in it. They're 5-5, but if they were to fall out of it, I mean, Puka and Cooper Kupp are constantly banged up. I mean, constantly. So I could see those guys taking it easy a little bit if they fall out of the race. Mark or Daigle, any more thoughts on this question before we move on?
They purposely move division games the last few years to the end of the season to avoid situations like this. And the NFC South, the NFC West, the Rams included, are all so tight. The Falcons had a chance to run away with it after the Godwin and Evans injuries. They instead failed miserably to do so. So I think all those teams, even the Panthers, are fighting for a playoff spot, as crazy as that sounds. I think all those teams are perfectly fine. Jack hit on the one that I'm worried most about, and it's the Jets. I just don't know what direction they go because they have the same record, 3-8, as the Patriots, but the Patriots are getting better every week, whereas the Jets get worse every week. And so those guys are just going to follow their leader, Aaron Rodgers, and there's nothing like he can do, he's done so far for us to believe that it's going to be positive the rest of the year. So I am worried about Adams, Garrett Wilson, those guys just following in line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If they did have to go to Ty God, though, I think they'd be okay. But to Daigle's point, maybe Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams don't come along for the ride if Rodgers shuts it down. Okay. Holden Hill said, what's your guys' rest of season outlook on Malik Neighbors with Tommy DeVito? So talk to Silva about this a little bit yesterday. Mark, we are at 25 overall now on Neighbors, down 5 spots from last week. What do you think about Neighbors rest of season?
It's really tricky because the Giants have an amazing rest of season schedule for wide receivers. And I'm also not necessarily convinced that DeVito starts the rest of the way. Maybe if things go poorly enough, they do end up throwing Drew Lock out there. So it's tricky in a few regards. There was also some news this week that the Giants players weren't necessarily happy with how the Daniel Jones benching was handled. So I'm a little worried about just kind of like implosion of this whole team and an organization, obviously without Andrew Thomas the rest of the season, their O-line, and Tommy DeVito is just going to be a sitting duck back there. So I'm more worried than excited about Neighbors, but if you look at the schedule and see the matchups that he has, like he could still get 10 targets a game. He still probably should. So I'm definitely really torn on that. I know that isn't necessarily the best answer and helpful, but I think it could still be good, but it could also be a tire fire and someone who Daigle has sharply mentioned as a sell, kind of the last few weeks on the show.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, that was a great call by Daigle. And I would say that I would think we should be lower on Neighbors in the rankings if it wasn't for this schedule. Bucks, Cowboys, Saints, Ravens, Falcons, Colts. That is literally like the best possible, I think one of the best possible setups for wide receiver here. So we'll see how it goes with DeVito, but yeah. Yater FinFan says, rest of season better option, Will Dissly or TJ Hawkinson. Well, Daigle, I got Dissly wrong for the literal 20th consecutive time this past weekend. I'm the wrong person to ask about this. What do you think, Daigle? Hawkinson or Dissly rest of the way?
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask about Hawkinson just because I've been down on him since last year. He flopped a royal flush. He made 7 starts without Justin Jefferson and with Josh Dobbs, who targeted his tight ends at a league high rate across 2 separate teams. You can't have that better of a run out again. So I still question Hawkinson's ceiling. Very clearly, he's struggling, at least right now. We can still use the out that it's because he's being eased back in. Has yet to run around in over 70% of dropbacks in any game so far. So rest of season, what does it look like? I would imagine they want to get him trending up and more confident in his ability ahead of the playoffs. So I do think it will get better, but still probably fringe tight end 1 for me.
Yeah, we have Hawkinson significantly ahead in the rankings, and maybe we should make it a little bit tighter here, but I do prefer Hawkinson. I mean, just 2 games ago, he had 8 catches for 72 yards on 9 targets, and I'm not sure that Dissly is ever catching 8 balls in a game, but he's certainly been really, really good.
Don't speak ill of Will Dissly, man.
I know.
And out of nowhere too.
Let's go to Tuffy McShites here. Tuffy McShites, Jack says, if you could own only one Tampa running back for the stretch, who would it be? Interesting question there. Obviously, there's 3 guys. I don't think it can be Sean Tucker, considering he just didn't play in the game. So, Jack, what do you think? Rachaad White or Bucky Irving rest of season?
Yeah, I would take Bucky there. I think, first of all, as the rookie, he has more upside. He's also been the better runner so far this year, and the Bucs just have the easiest schedule for the rest of the season among, I think, basically any team in the league. And so that sets up well for Bucky Irving as the guy who's going to be getting the bulk of the carries. We've also seen Rachaad White in a 3-down role if something were to happen to Bucky Irving. We've seen what Rachaad White in a workhorse role looks like all of last year, and it was good, but it wasn't anything groundbreaking. Whereas if something happens to Rachaad White, we really could see Bucky Irving explode, just given that he's looked like the more explosive player so far this year.
Yeah. And, I was going to include Bucky in my move to make, but this schedule that they have is going to lend to more positive game scripts. And in positive game scripts, Bucky has gotten more work than normal, right? When they're trailing, it's going to be more Rachaad. When they're winning, it's going to be more Bucky. So I think they'll be winning more games here down the stretch, certainly like Bucky. The other part of this question was, if you could only own one Cleveland wide receiver for the stretch, who would it be? Judy popped up for a big game. We've seen Tillman have big games. I think Elijah Moore remains viable. Jack, what about this one? Which Cleveland wide receiver rest of season?
Yeah, I'd take Tillman for the upside. I mean, Judy just had a big game. I think he's perfectly viable too, as long as James remains the starter. But I think Tillman has a ceiling that Judy doesn't have as the ascending younger player.
Yeah, I do think the Cleveland stuff is an interesting sell for the reasons that we've talked about already here today. Is Jameis going to make it through Steelers, Broncos, Steelers, Chiefs next 4 games? I don't know. I call it like 50-50. And, so if somebody wants to give me a bunch of stuff right now for Tillman or Judy, I'd at least consider it. All right. Oh, I missed this one, Mark. Let's go back to this one. Abo Gavich says, is Devonta Smith a good buy low or a sell? Recent performance has been underwhelming, but you'd think the run-heavy approach may regress a bit. I noticed a big drop in the rest of season 150 this week. Eagles have been the most run-centric team over the last month. So even though I think A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith are playing well, it's been really tough for them to get there in a big way. How are you thinking about Devonta Smith right now, Mark?
It's tough because his target shares are still good. It's just the pass volume isn't there. So even though he's getting, a low 20% target share, that's amounting to like 5 or 6 targets a week, which is why we dropped him more into the wide receiver, at low end wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 range this week. This Eagles defense has gotten quite a bit better as well, especially in the pass game. And Jalen Carter has emerged. He played 100% of the snaps their last game, which is pretty wild for a D tackle. But yeah, the Eagles don't necessarily profile as a shootout team that we maybe thought coming into the season, and have definitely leaned into the running game with Saquon. So I would lean potentially sell low on Devonta Smith, as much as I hate to say that. I have a lot of him in both best ball and season long, so I'm hoping it turns around. They do have a good schedule, but with their defense stiffening up and just the lack of passing attempts of this offense, I'd probably lean sell low.
Okay. Last question here, Daigle. It's an interesting one from a strategy standpoint. He says so many defenses with good matchups in the fantasy playoffs are cheeks, which, I had no idea what that meant until recently. Now I understand that cheeks does mean bad. So he says, how do we consider defense quality versus matchup? So to me, defense quality is like not that important once we get into the streaming range, right? There's certain defenses that I think are awesome at the top, and you can play them against most matchups. However, once you get into the streaming range, all I care about is who they're playing. Like, I want quarterbacks that are going to drop back a lot and make a lot of mistakes. So when you're thinking about streaming for the playoffs, my take is it's way more important to think about the quarterback that you're going up against, how many times he'll drop back, how mistake prone he is, versus the quality of the defense. Daigle, anything to add there for people streaming the defenses?
One, you should use the term cheeks on the Friday show around Silva and see if he catches on, because spoiler alert, he will not. And two, Pat Thorman and I have been syncing up our rankings more from the waiver wire to his rankings end of week for defenses, because people love getting defenses right, by the way. And I think he's coming around to my idea, like you said, that a lot of the time it is the quarterback. That's all we're doing, is saying this guy's bad. I'm going to play this defense against this bad guy. Yeah. And there are some instances where I question it, like the Jaguars we mentioned have one of the best, at least on paper, postseason schedules. But in a Superflex league, for instance, I would still stream Gardner Minshew against the Jaguars any day of the week, because I bet Brock Bowers can at least get there and carry Minshew along with him. So yeah, I just look at the quarterback, and that's how I played it, honestly. And that may not get you the defensive one on the entire week, which is everyone's looking for, but still, we're looking for top 12 options, and I still believe we can easily get those every single week 15 on, due to the backups in.
Sure. Yeah, clearly. And if there's a kickoff return for a touchdown, or a punt return for a touchdown, or a guy happens to scoop and score instead of get tackled right away, those big events are going to decide defense each week. That is not projectable really in much of a way. What is projectable is how many times will a bad quarterback drop back? And to me, that's the biggest thing.
It's okay to have the defensive 9 ranked on the week instead of the defensive 5. Like, that's totally fine. I think everyone just continues striving to have it better, but in most instances you cannot, and that's okay. Like, you are still going to be close by a marginal fraction, and perhaps due to the volatility of the position, even outscore the higher defenses.
All right. We've made it to the portion of the program that everybody loves. They haven't listened to anything we've said. They've fast forwarded to the one move to make before week 12. I believe it's Jack's turn to go first here this week. If you are ready, Jack, go ahead with your move to make ahead of week 12.
Yeah, I'm going to say add Blake Corum. He played a season high 19% of snaps last week. To be honest, I'm not completely sure that matters really at all. I think we know Sean McVay loves Kyren Williams, and he's probably just going to go back to near full Kyren. So I don't think you're getting any standalone value out of Blake Corum. But like we talked about earlier in the show, if you're picking up a running back stash, all you care about is upside, and Blake Corum is one of the few running backs in the league where if Kyren Williams goes down, he is going to be a 3-down running back. Ronnie Rivers has been completely phased out. Blake Corum, because of his lack of standalone value, I think he should be available pretty much everywhere, whereas a lot of these guys like Tyler Algier, like Braylon Allen are probably pretty widely owned, but Corum does nothing pretty much every week, but he has a path to 20 touches if something happens to Kyren Williams. So I am going to say add Blake Corum.
Add Blake Corum. Fits with the theme of the show, preparing for the playoffs. Daigle, your move to make ahead of week 12.
I also like buying Kyren Williams, by the way. I think we get infatuated with the idea of stashing around this time of the year when what if we just get the better player? What if we get the starter in an offense competing for the playoffs? So I like buying Kyren Williams. That's not my move, though. That's a bonus. I like buying Calvin Ridley ahead of the fantasy postseason. Mark touched on the Titans schedule. We have 4 games now without DeAndre Hopkins for Ridley, and he's earned 39%, 30%, 39%, and 21% of the team's targets. In weeks 15 through 17, the Bengals, the Colts, and the Jaguars. That sounds like a winning wide receiver to me.
Love it. Yeah. I mean, that's a really good one, and I can't believe it, but I think Ridley, especially for the best ball stuff, like if you can squeak a Ridley team in there, I don't know what his advance rate is. It can't be that high. That's going to be a really good one, I think.
It was always part of the process that DeAndre Hopkins would get traded to the Chiefs. That's why you were drafting him in March.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Mark, your one move to make ahead of week 12.
I'm going to go with sell Tyreek Hill if your trade deadline has not passed. Tyreek finally had a decent game in week 11, caught 7 balls, scored a touchdown. So you can sell that as he's, rounding into form, finally getting back to last year's numbers. But I think this Dolphins team is just flat out different this year, and they're spreading the ball around more. I do not think Tyreek Hill is the alpha wide receiver one that he was last year. I also think this Dolphins team is one that, Tyreek is someone that could potentially sit down the stretch. He has this torn ligament in his wrist. The Dolphins are 4-6 right now. They have a favorable schedule. So, they could be in the playoff race, but they could also easily fall out. And we could see Tyreek call it quits early to get surgery on that wrist. So I think there's risk of that. They also have a tough fantasy playoff schedule as well. They're at Houston against the 49ers and at the Browns. So I think now is the perfect time to sell Tyreek Hill. I think you can get a decent return for him.
Yep. I think that's a good one. We have Tyreek Hill up here at 26 overall, but if you had to sell a little bit lower than that, I wouldn't hate it considering all the things Mark was talking about. Definitely agree about the wrist and shutting it down, and the schedule non-ideal either. All right. You guys know me. I mean, I love thinking about the schedules, and people were tired. I was getting messages. They were like, Adam, we get it. The Eagles have a really good schedule coming up. We get it. Where they were getting annoyed. Buddy, you're not annoyed now when everybody's like, oh, see, Jalen Hurts should be the MVP. How about maybe they just ran into the softest stretch of schedule the NFL has ever seen, right? And so similarly, down the stretch, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, this is their schedule. Giants, Panthers, Raiders, at Chargers, their one tough game, then Cowboys, Panthers. They get the Panthers twice, the Cowboys once, the Giants once, and the Raiders once the rest of the way. So I want to buy all Bucks. I added Bucks defense in my season-long league here today. Plan to kind of just ride that out with them for a while. If Bucky Irving was available, if Rachaad White was available, if Mike Evans was available, I would be looking to buy all those guys as well. This is an incredible schedule rest of the way for the Tampa Bay Bucks. All right. That is going to do it for this edition of the Rest of Season Top 150 show. We will not be back next week because in honor of Thanksgiving week, 2 free shows coming on YouTube that normally would never be free. Establish a show for the 3-game slate on Thanksgiving. Establish the million for the 3-game Thanksgiving slate as well. Both of those will be free on YouTube next week instead of the Rest of Season Top 150 show. Stay tuned for that. For Daigle, for Jack, for Mark, producer Ryan, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.